Hello and welcome back to Fullerton College's Print 101 Introduction to Print. Today we're going to talk about ink, which comes from chapter 22 of our textbook. Hat tip and thanks to Professor Glenn Hirth for putting together these slides. They make my life easier and everyone's life easier and are a good companion to reading your book. Anyways, let's carry on here. Chapter 22, we're going to talk about what ink is. I know it's kind of obvious, but there's still, or it may seem obvious, but there's still definitions and terms to know about this stuff and how to talk about ink, how to discuss its properties to understand what it's made out of and what it's attempting to do. First off, ink is what we use to print with, mostly the most common coating for a printed substrate. They're made with different things. They can flow differently. They have different stiffnesses, different stickinesses. They dry differently. They work on different types of substrates. They will work on different types of presses. Typically speaking, unless you're talking screen printing, in which case, all bets are off because that stuff can do anything. You really need to very carefully match the ink type, not only to the substrate, but also to the press type. Some inks work well on some systems, but would do nothing on another. We'll get to there. So the earliest stuff, the earliest inks coming from ancient Egypt and ancient China were used by using soot and mixing it with a gum of some sort. Gums come from plants, or kind of a plant resin. You would take plant resin and soot from a fire, ash, soot, leftover blackness from charcoal, and you'd mix them together. And the Chinese would dry them into sticks, and they would then wet them down when they wanted to use them again. So they could be stored dry and used damp, kind of like a watercolor paint, really. And in fact, paint and ink are not that different. They're rather similar. Gutenberg used an oil-based ink because linseed oil was already a common paint binder in Europe when he was developing his movable type printing press in the 1400s. Most actually around his time, that was cutting edge. Most paintings from around Gutenberg's time and right after were done using linseed oil as the vehicle that held the pigments in the paint. Previous to his time, tempera paint, which is egg-based, was more common. So he was right there contemporary with his time when he decided to use oil mixed with lamp black, which again is soot from burning candles and oil. Anyways, you put those together and you're able to carry the pigment and attach it to something else. Basically, ink formulation is what we're talking about here. Gutenberg's ink and the ancient Chinese and Egyptian inks all use the same basic ideas of ingredients. Maybe not the exact same ingredients, but the same purposes of ingredients. Kind of how in baking you can have different purposes for the same, or different ingredients for the same purpose. You could use actual yeast to make your dough rise, or you could use baking powder or baking soda. Any three of those leavening agents will cause your bread or your treats, your cookies and your cupcakes and stuff to rise when baked. But they're not the same as each other, but they have the same effect. Anyways, you get the same types of ingredients in all inks and also all paints, and really anything you use to mark anything at all, except for pencil, which is a little bit different. So you have vehicle, pigment, and additives. Vehicle is a binding agent. It's also known as a carrier. I've learned it as a carrier back when I was in art school and undergrad. Ink, or for paint, carrier. The carrier is what it's made out of. In fact, paints are named after their carriers. You can have watercolor paints in which water is what's going to hold the pigments while you apply it to the paper. You can have acrylic paints, which uses acrylic resin, which is basically a liquid plastic to hold your pigments and then dry onto your canvas. Or you can use oil paint, which, just like the Gutenberg ink and his contemporary paintings, is actually made out of oil and does not dry, because oil doesn't dry. Oil oxidizes. It takes a lot longer to dry. Anyways, so ink as well will have some sort of vehicle, some sort of material in which the color or the pigment is suspended. The pigment is what gives the ink its color. Black pigment is the easiest to make, and the first one, therefore, as well, because black is the most common color of pigment found in nature, and it's very easy to make. You simply need to burn something and gather the soot, and that's called carbon black. Cheap black ink is made out of soot of some sort, and that's why it's the cheapest. It's so easy to make soot. You can even find soot natural. If you wanted to not start your own fire, you could find a fire that's burned out somewhere, even in nature, and you can get yourself black ink from that. Colors are a little more difficult, especially because most natural things in the world, as brightly colored as they are when you find them, the color fades. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to make your own pigments or try to work with things in nature, but it's interesting. If you try to dye things or make paints or inks out of flower petals, sure, they're brightly colored. They're even fluorescent in nature. But when they dry out, that bright, intense purple of that lavender becomes faded. And the more you use it and the longer it sits, the more it becomes brown. All organic matter eventually turns brown when you try to use it. It's one of the reasons a lot of old fashioned clothes, when you see them in museums and when people redo them in movies, why they always seem to be wearing earth tones all the time. It's not that everyone liked to dress earthy and try to look like they're camouflaged. It's because using a natural vegetable dye, even if it started out bright colored, it would fade quickly or slowly over time to being brown. One of the reasons purple dye was so expensive in the old days, and by the way, some of the originals have been found recently from pre-Roman times. Actually, you might want to call them biblical times. So in the 3000s-ish BC or BCE, as they call it these days, in Israel, they found some original purple dyed cloth recently that is still bright purple after 5,000 years. Some good stuff. Anyways, it's very hard to get pigment that is that good. In fact, the ancient purples that were so common, not common, sorry, common is the wrong word. Only royalty and emperors got to wear that kind of color. You had to be extremely wealthy and powerful to afford it because it involved harvesting specific sea life. So you had to have someone swim down in the ocean, pick up certain mollusks, kill them, grind them up, and it took thousands of mollusks killed and ground up and processed to make a single garment, a single jacket or coat or robe that was purple. And as a result of many years of purple harvesting, they're now extinct and you can no longer make that color. Anyways, so pigments come from different things. Pigments can also be made out of stuff that is ground up. A lot of times they're dry powders that are made. Some of them are made organically, some of them are made chemically, and some of them are more mineral based. In fact, one of the most expensive historic blues was made out of a rare stone, lapis lazuli, which was the color blue for the longest time. Before blue became a cheap dye and they figured out how to make it synthetically, that was one of the rarest colors in the world because it had to come from a gemstone to be able to make the color blue. Blue is extremely rare in nature. I'm sorry, I got to get off color theory. I didn't mean to do that to you. You can also use them flush, which is you just disperse a paste into a vehicle. Different brands of model paints, because by the way, I'm a dorky miniatures painter on my weekends here. Some brands use solid, dry pigment in the acrylic resins that I paint with. Other brands use a liquid paste pigment. If any of you know your stuff and into that sort of thing, companies like Vallejo and Citadel, they use the dry pigment powders that are suspended into the liquids. If you get the P3 Reaper paints, those actually have a liquid pigment. That means you can thin them and dilute them much further without seeing the specks of pigment. I don't know if any of you have ever played around with paint. I know I'm talking about ink, but it's a similar concept here. If you take watercolor or some acrylic paints and you dilute them a lot with water, for a while you can add water and thin them down and make them less intense. But if you add too much water, the pigment separates from the vehicle and you start to see little specks of it floating around. Anyways, that's what happens if you overdo that. Dyes can also be used as opposed to pigments. Dyes are definitely liquid and not paste or solid. There's also additives. The third ingredient in most ink is an additive. And additives change the characteristics. They make things stickier or less sticky. They make things stick better or be a little more temporary. They make things dry faster. Some of them are lubricants. Why would you lubricate ink? Well, sometimes ink acts as a lubricant for the press. The ink itself is what touches when two rollers touch each other. And if it's too abrasive there, it's going to wear out the roller. So the ink needs to lubricate as it works. You know, waxes, starches, all sorts of things can be added to them to do different things to make the ink act differently physically. Dryers are most common. They help things dry faster, which helps you avoid set off, which we'll talk about later. There's also things that can make you can dry using heat or infrared radiation to accelerate oxidation on oil-based inks. And sometimes special chemicals are involved where you use ultraviolet radiation to cure an ink into a solid. That's more of a polymerization where it takes a liquid plastic polymer and the UV light cures it into a solid. I have a press like that in our lab. It's a large inkjet. It's kind of fun to use, although the smell of UV ink is distinctive and strong and a bit insidious. So you got to watch out for that. While it may be food safe when it's cured sometimes, depending on the UV ink, working with it is somewhat hazardous, I have found. Also, it's very easy to identify a UV pressed by the smell of the ink. Many years ago, back when you could do these things, I had my family at Knott's Berry Farm, and I was walking through their shops section in their Old West town, and I went, I know that smell. And sure enough, I turned left and there was a custom take home sign shop where you make vintage looking signs for your garage that say, my name's only park here or so-and-so's garage and tune up. Kind of quaint and vintage looking. But that smell, I was like, you have a UV press. In fact, I was able to identify the brand of press they had in the back. I started talking to the shop owner because like, I know that you're using an EFI in there, aren't you? I know exactly the ink you're using. It's a very distinctive smell. Now, note the ink is chemical product and needs to be handled properly. Back to that UV ink, which is the most extreme of the ones I'm talking about. The UV ink, if you're in a confined space with it for too long, everything starts to smell with it like it, and it even starts to taste like it. I have a personal story from a time in our lab when I was working late one night printing some posters on the big poster printer that does the UV inkjet stuff. And I had gotten dinner and was still there working, and I had a big cup of Dr. Pepper, one of my favorite drinks, you know. And I was there sipping my Dr. Pepper and printing. And after a while, I noticed that Dr. Pepper started to taste like the ink smelled. In case anybody is wondering, that is not a good thing. So yeah, don't eat near some of the inks. Also, special care has to be taken care of. And in fact, ink waste is considered hazardous waste and can't just be thrown away in the trash. Of course, if you dry it out all the way, then it's just garbage, right? But anyways, ink is considered hazardous waste a lot of times. So use accordingly. Follow the safety features on the thing. Shortcuts aren't worth it if they cost you your health. All right, we're going to talk about the next bit here for a little bit here. Let's talk about what the things are. Whoops. So ready to go back? Let's go back. I'm not that great with PowerPoint. We are going to talk about some next things here. We're going to talk about color strength, about ink body. There's a little picture up here of set off, however. Set off, also sometimes called offset, although I don't like that phrase because it gets you confused with offset printing. Set off is when you've stacked papers that have been printed, but the ink hasn't dried. And so the back side of one sheet has the front side of the other sheet's image stuck to it. That's called set off. You may have seen it before. You can commonly find it in cheaper, faster printed things like junk mail brochures, like the ads from a supermarket. Things done on newsprint are often printed very fast and not even dried all the way before they're shipped to somebody. So look at those, you'll find it. It's very rare to find it in a book, but you can. So we're gonna talk about color strength, ink body, ink stability, ink length, tack, drying time. These are ways of talking about the characteristics of ink. How do you discuss what it is physically? And a lot of these things also definitely, they affect how it looks, they affect how it acts as a physical medium, and they definitely change how it dries. And one of the most important things for us in print is how our ink dries. If it doesn't dry quick enough or solidly enough before you start doing things like cutting off the edges of your papers or binding them into a book or die cutting cool shapes out of it, you're going to have a bad time. Again, set off. Set off is when ink on one side of the paper sticks to the back of the next paper because it wasn't dry when you started stacking it. The best way to prevent this is to make sure the ink is dry. The best way to do that is to set your ink up correctly to dry quick enough. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of extra time waiting for your ink to dry. I think we're going to stop here for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Whoops, sorry about that. And we will pick up next time.